Hello friends, welcome to today's special lecture Symbolic Expression, and in the studio we have Manisha Sharma as a sign language expert, and the topic of today's discussion is film censorship, colonial period in India. In the earlier lecture on film censorship, colonial period in India, we talked about the kind of censorship which was being imposed by the British in the context of safeguarding their own interests. We talked about how the censorship was largely political in nature, it was arbitrary, and it was largely concerned with the revolutionary ideas coming from Russia or democratic ideas coming from America. And any kinds of ideas which were talking about the freedom of India, which were talking about the advocacy of democratic rule, they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And before the coming of the Indian Cinematograph Act, we talked about how the commissioners of the police, they were the main deciding factor in terms of the colonial censorship with regard to the films. And even when the Indian Cinematograph Act came in 1918, we find that the powers of the commissioners of the police, they did not reduce, and we find that when such kind of measures which came to India with regard to the censorship and the various kinds of concern which were being raised by the Indians as well, we find that the concerns of the sex and violence which were being shown in the films, they were being raised by the Indians at different levels. And thereafter we find that the Indian Cinematograph Committee was in a way instituted by the British so that the imperial preferences, which was a euphemism for the British films, and how the British films they could be promoted in India. But we find that even the Cinematograph Committee did not support this kind of an idea of the colonial rulers, and they said that if the British considered that the American films which were being exhibited in India were in a way presumed to be British films, but the similar kind of a thing could be can be suggested with regard to the adolescents, that if they will watch the American films or if they will watch the British films, both the films they were harmful for them. And we also talked about a film called Bhakt Vidur, that how it was being censored during the colonial period. The kind of ideas which were being suggested in Bhakt Vidur, they were not liked by the colonial censorship machinery. And we also see that during 1930s, when the sound came through Alamara, which was the first talkie, we find that the ideas of civil disobedience movement, which was concerned with the national movement, they were also spreading in the Indian population as well. And we see that the government had this kind of an idea where they wanted to restrict these kinds of concerns of the Indians, where any kind of ideas concerning the national movement, they should not be exhibited. And we find that apart from Bhakt Vidur, which came in 1921, there was another film called Reth, which came in 1931. And in Salem, in one of the areas, the magistrate suspended the screening of this film by Imperial Film Company. It was being made and it had the political overtones, and the government supported this decision, and board agreed with the government as well. So we find that this particular film dealt with the religious bigotry, caste system, non-violence and untouchability, and the character Baba Garib Das, Kuvasji Makanda, had a remarkable physical resemblance to Gandhi, to whom the caste and creed held no meaning. And we find the depiction of the principles of the Gandhian philosophy by a lookalike of Gandhi, it sent the shivers down the spine of the censors, and it resorted to large-scale deletion of the scenes. And we later find that a truncated version of this film under the title of Khuda Ki Shaan was later allowed to be released. We also see during this time that when you talk about that how the boards they were functioning, the censor boards were functioning, they were arbitrary, irregular and cynical in nature. And Mrs. F. Stanley, one of the members of the Bengal board, told the press that the boards was not giving the most of the films, and it was not viewing them, and the censoring was done only by the inspectors. So that was one of the concern, that when board was not viewing them and only it was the task was assigned to the inspectors, then they were not applying their mind in the way they should have applied, and we find because of which there were certain discrepancies and anomalies in terms of film censorship. And we also see that how when you talk about the concerns in 1930s. Then B.V. Jadhav, who was the president of the Motion Picture Society of India, he described the situation in these words, that the central government will not take any trouble of laying down any standard for the guidance of the provincial boards, and consequently the inspectors, they have become autocrats and apply their scissors at their sweet will in cutting out the portions which they consider as undesirable, and an appeal to the board of censors is rarely of any use. So we find that how apart from the ideas of revolutionary ideas from Russia or the ideas of democracy coming from America, we find that how the British censors, they were sensitive to the themes of the workers' strikes, communism and opposition to capitalism, and they kept a cautious eye on such kind of themes. And many of the films, like one of the films which was written by Munshi Premchand with the title of Mil aur Mazdoor, and how this was a story of an honest portrayal of the labor capital conflict in those times, the kind of situation which was prevailing in the mills and the exploitation of the working class. In this particular story by Munshi Premchand, which was being written by him for this particular film, and this was being considered as a kind of a situation which was not likable to the boards and the government as well. And this film was in a way banned for the travesty of the mill life as well as the management, and the effects of which are likely to be harmful to the relations between the employers and the workers in India. So these were the kind of concerns of the British the censor boards, and they did not want that any kind of a film was to be exhibited which might in a way create a situation where the labor take up arms against the British. And they also did not want any kind of a film which was critical of the capitalists and the capitalist life. And we find that when these kinds of films, they were being banned, so later it was titled as Seth Ki Ladki, and it was again in a way shown to the censors. But we find that the colonial censors, they were not even happy even after that, and we find that the idea of the capital and the labor conflict was to be seen by the censors, and they in a way did not want that such kind of scenes they should be shown to the audience, and they believe that it will provide some kind of an incitement to discontent in the circle of the labours. And finally we see that this film was released as Daya Ki Devi, as Aruna Vasudev has suggested that the two truncated versions, they were there, and thereafter the film was released. And later Munshi Premchand, he also admitted that the way film industry functioned at that point of time and the kind of liberty which was being taken by the filmmakers in terms of producing or exhibiting that particular film. So after that he did not write any film for the film industry as well. And we also find that how the various kinds of themes which were concerning the national movement or any kind of revolutionary ideas which were there with regard to the ideas of Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad and Jogesh Chandra Chatterjee, because we find that the revolutionary movement at that point of time, especially in 1920s, 30s, was led by these people, and Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, they were at the forefront of such kind of a movement. And these kinds of ideas, they were also being reflected in many of the films as well. And the government was very well aware as well that the kind of organizations which were in a way emerging, like All India Trade Union Congress or All India Kisan Sabha, all of them, they were contributing to the growing suspicion of the imperialist government against any kind of a movement which will be inimical to the interests of the Raj. And when you see the situation from the world point of view, we find that how the Soviet Union, it survived the Great Depression. And when you see China, we find that the Communist Party of China was gaining strength when it was being compared to Kuomintang or KMT. And the American ideas of democracy, all of them, they were from the international point of view. They were not liked by the British. They did not want that such kind of scenes or dialogues they were to be exhibited to the Indian audience where they had these kinds of themes. and not only the foreign films, but in the context of the Indian films as well. We find that there was a film called Mahatma on the life of Saint Eknath, and it was later released with a number of accessions as Dharmatma. And the government was censoring the scenes of social religious reforms in India in the films which were based on the lives of the saints of the medieval Indian Bhakti movement, because they could be linked to the reform movement which was launched by Gandhi, and it bred the danger of propagation and proliferation of Gandhian ideas, ideology and the philosophy. So we basically find that the objectives and the ideals of the national movement, they were not being liked by the censors, and censors, they were ready to promote any kind of American style obscene and stunt films which were there to influence the cultural values of the people, so that they can be misguided in their movement towards the path of the nationalist ideals as well as the values. And we find that this kind of a conspirational cultural policy of the British was realized by some of the magazines, and they attacked the British. Abhyuday and Film India, both these magazines, they attacked British from that point of view, and Abhyuday launched a comprehensive attack against such British designs in its columns as well. And we also see that how British, they wanted to wean the Muslims away from the national mainstream, and the British, they tried to placate them by becoming extremely sensitive to the issues that might offend the Muslims, and their policy to placate them was also reflected in the film censorship as well. And we find that each member of the film censors had one or two Muslim members whose suggestions relating to the scenes dealing with Muslims, they were scrupulously carried out. Even a distant possibility of offense to Muslim sentiments was considered sufficient to censor a film. And films like Virgin of Istanbul in 1920, passed by the censor board of Burma, was banned by the Bombay board, which thought that certain ideas are likely to offend the Mohammedan community. So we find that British, they were very, very concerned, and S.T. Bhaskaran writes that the 48 Door story depicting the struggle between the Christians and the Muslims in Middle East was proscribed first in Bombay and then in other provinces, because it portrayed the Egyptian officials in an unsavory light. So we find that all these films which would in any way hurt the Muslim sentiments, they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and these kinds of ideas, they were also talked about at the official level as well. When we find in 1933 in the Legislative Assembly, in the words of Sadiq Hassan, that there is a great resentment among the Muslim, where scenes of haram life are depicted in films, and especially when historic Muslim queens and princesses are shown making love. So these kinds of ideas, they were being talked about at official levels, and we find that how Times of India reported in 1935 that a scene 250 feet in showing several Muslims sitting around a table in a cosmopolitan club and drinking liquor was deleted from a film which was produced in Bombay. And censor authorities, they communicated that no Muslim should be shown drinking liquor in a film meant for public screening, as it would offend the Islamic sentiments. And similar was the case with other ideas as well, where we find that they were also concerned with the states, which were the princely states, and where we find that The Terror or Chalta Purja was a film in 1929, and it was the first film which was the story of an imaginary Maharaja of Kantipur and the resident. And this film was also in a way censored by the colonial authorities, and they said that the film was nothing but a parody on the mannerisms of the native rulers, and existing relations between the government and the native rulers did not permit them to release this film for exhibition. And the same board also proscribed The Searchlight, another film, on the ground that it tended to bring into disrepute rulers of Indian princely states. And we find that many American films, they also in a way invited the wrath of the censors when they were talking about the ideas of freedom. And Patriot, another film in 1928, which was different from the Indian film of the same title, it dealt with the theme of popular uprising and the overthrow of authority, and it was banned in United Provinces and then in other provinces as well. and the censors, they asked to omit the following subtitle, that we are fighting for freedom from tyranny as your country once did. So these kinds of ideas, they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and apart from that we also see that a number of topicals, they were also being banned by the colonial censors for the political reasons, and we find that later they were being allowed to be released when the new ministries, they were being formed in 1930s, especially in 1937, and when we find that the General of the Motion Picture Society of India documented 15 films which were released for exhibition during the relaxation period of the film censorship. And in 1940s also we find that these kinds of things, they were being continued, any kind of references, dialogue, scenes, songs, etc., which were there with regard to freedom, ahimsa, removal of untouchability, prohibition of liquor, Congress, democracy, Gandhi, all of them, they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and we find that many of the films, they were making such kind of references where all these kinds of ideas, they were being exhibited. Brandy Ki Bottle was in a way supporting the prohibition of liquor, or even the stunt films, they were talking about democracy, and films like Raja Harishchandra, they were trying to equate satyagraha to the ideas of Raja Harishchandra. Then many of the films which were made during this time of different genres, they were trying to communicate these ideas, and all these ideas with regard to charkha, etc., they were, or portrait of the national movement leaders, they were being shown in the films. And there was a film called Kismat in 1942 which talked about a song called Aaj Himale ki choti se fir humne lalkara hai, dur hato hai duniya walon, Hindustan hamara hai. And this film was also trying to communicate the ideas of the national movement, and this film was made in 1943. Where you find that the Quit India movement started in 1942 and it was continuing. So this kind of a call of Dur Hato Hai Duniya Walo was equated with the Quit India movement which was launched in 1942. And we find that the ideas of the government, the way government functioned, and the censorship machinery which was obnoxious in nature, and it did not want the films to be exhibited which were dealing with the ideas of national movement, and they restricted the length of the feature films to 11,000 feet and trailers to 400 feet. And we also find that they put embargo on the production of the new films, and even on making of the new prints of the duly certified pictures, that was also restricted. And the licenses which were being given to the producer, they were being given now on their past performances, and they were also given on a guarantee that every third film which will be produced by them would be based on an approved subject. So we find that British, they were trying to restrict the Indians in every manner, and the kind of rules which they made during this time, like Defence of India rules, it in a way the exhibition of the 200 feet of the approved film was made compulsory for every exhibition during this time. And we find that the director of the war publicity was put on the censor board to ensure that films contain nothing that would work against the war efforts. And we also find that how during this particular period in 1940s they established the Information Films of India, IFI, for the exclusive production of the newsreels and documentary. And it in a way wanted to promote the war effort and boost the morale of the armed forces in that way which were fighting for the British. And we find that British, they wanted to throttle the nationalist aspirations which were being expressed through films, and they did not want that films, they should be used as an instrument of propaganda. And they wanted to in a way promote films which were suiting the colonial policies of those times. And we also find that during this particular period, any kind of a background which was there of the national movement in the films, that was being rejected by the colonial censors. And there was a film Hamara Desh which was in Marathi. It was banned on the charges of being seditious and advocating the cult of violence. And we also see during this time that how the the films which were talking about the victory of good over evil, democracy, justice, good governance, freedom of speech and expression. For example, the stunt films, they were making such kind of ideas, they were being rejected. And a film called Sikandar, which was made in 1940s, was also talking about this idea. And Sikandar was also in a way rejected by the colonial censors, because when it was being shown in the cantonment areas, the soldiers, they were very happy with such kind of a portrayal. When Sikandar and Porus, they came against each other, and when Porus talked about that how a king should be treated by another king. So when we talk about these kinds of ideas and how the rulers of an earlier period, they were being projected and they were trying to communicate their ideas of independence, they were also being in a way seen to be in consonance with the times which were the times of the contemporary period. And we also see that how various kinds of scenes which were relating to sex and violence, which were concerning the morality and the ethics, the censors, they were lenient to all these kinds of scenes. And Rameshwari Nehru, who was a member of the censor board, she talked about these kinds of concerns at the official platform, that such kind of standards which were to be maintained when these kinds of films, they were to be made. And we find that many films like Light of Asia, Throw of Dice, Karma, Zarina, all of them, they were showing intensely hot embraces, passionate kissing, etc. And so we find that ideas of nationalism, ideas of democracy, ideas of revolution, they were bothering the censors more. And in the context of censorship, we have a lot of debates in the contemporary times as well. And a number of challenges are also there, keeping in mind the way technology has changed over a period of time. Internet, mobile, social networking sites, hidden cameras, all of them, they are there. So new kinds of challenges to censorship have come over a period of time. And censorship has both its pros and cons, and the idea of cinematic liberty is also attached to the idea of freedom of speech and expression. So all these are related to the issue of censorship in the contemporary times. With this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.